Sweet. All right. All right. Welcome in, everybody. This is the first roundtable edition of the Upper Left Performance Podcast, and I'm happy to bring in three panelists for this, three coaches, different sports, different levels in the college sector. We have Matt Troy, Kyle Bakas, and Max Watson joining us here today. And briefly, guys, we can start with Matt and then work our way through. Matt, if you want to just give a brief overview of where you've been, what you've done, and where you're at right now, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Matt Troy. I'm the head volleyball coach here at Johns Hopkins. And I originally started my career at Hopkins, and I was there for about 3 years. And then took the job over at University of Mary Washington and was there for 6 years, where I met, of course, you and Max. And then last year came back to Hopkins.
All right, awesome. And then Kyle, if you want to go next, that'd be great.
Sure. I'm Kyle Bakas. I'm the head men's soccer coach at Coe College in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I've only been here since about August and the head coach since November. Prior to that, I was working semi-professional soccer teams and a director at the youth level. So, yeah.
Awesome. And then Max?
Yeah, so I'm Max Watson, the head men's soccer coach at Virginia Military Institute, based out of Lexington, Virginia. I've actually also a recent hire, similar to Kyle. I got the job in what was March, before all the, maybe not the March madness we know, but the madness that started to ensue in March. And also obviously spent time with Jack and Matt at the University of Mary Washington, where I was an assistant for 3 seasons, and have spent coaching stints at multiple high schools and club level as well. So.
Awesome, guys. Thanks a lot. Now, jumping right into this, then, one of the things that I'm most interested in hearing from you guys is, a lot of times, like in the strength and conditioning industry, I feel like we kind of operate in our own silo a lot of times, specifically at lower levels, just because of how many sports the strength coach or the 2 people on staff have to work with. I think a lot of time is spent going, well, if this sport coach understood what we know about how to develop an athlete in some ways, like things would be so much better, blah, blah, blah. And I certainly have said those things myself before. But I think over the last year, I've done a lot of thinking about just how little and I think a lot of strength coaches, to be honest with you, would know about a particular sport. And the fact that we have these colleagues in terms of you guys who are just a wealth of information about, respectively soccer and volleyball. And I know Matt and I did discuss volleyball quite a bit, but I think honestly that was the only coach while I was at Mary Washington that I spent that much time talking about, like, technical and tactical development of volleyball, and it gave me a much better understanding of what to do in the weight room. And I just wanted to know, I don't know how much interaction you guys have with your respective strength coaches, but just kind of go into detail about maybe the best questions that we as strength and conditioning professionals could be asking that's going to generate better conversations for the development of our athletes.
And I can start us. No, so we're fortunate here with, just kind of the makeup of the department. And we have a strength and conditioning coach named Logan Moody, works specifically with us, and we're very close. And I think it's just lines of communication, right? I think sometimes the sport coaches and then the kind of strength and conditioning coaches, depending on the department and how busy and inundated everybody gets with work on a day-to-day basis, the next game, the next practice, the next travel, right? Whatever it might be. I think it's just tons of communication in terms of what, from the sports side, players are dealing with that moment, right? As well as on the academic side and all the stressors, and then pairing that up with what we're doing in the weight room, because I think when coaches get inundated with the day-to-day and what they're doing in training, and sometimes that lack of communication starts to happen, and then all of a sudden, maybe we lose track of what's going on in the weight room. And not that it's not good stuff, right? It's just, are we always properly pairing it with what we're doing on the technical side on the field and stuff like that?
Yeah, and to echo what Max said, I know I've worked closely with our strength coach to where I set up our soccer training sessions in advance so that they were periodized physically and tactically. and said, here's what we're doing each week. Here's what we're doing each day. Let's try and keep this in mind as you come up with what you're going through. And I think one of the biggest challenges is probably in an ideal world, we're harnessing and leveraging the power of the strength coach more and more on a daily basis. But when, like as Max is saying, when you're dealing with academic stressors, social stressors, kids living away from home for the first time, not to mention a super condensed, compact season where you're squeezing 20 games into 2 months. During season, it's rest and recovery. And I think that harnessing the strength coach to have another voice with your athletes saying, hey, don't go to the gym today, guys. It's the day of a game, or it's the day after. I know last year we had guys doing max out sessions because I've got a couple of big, strong boys on my team who love the mirrors. And they're doing max out sessions the day before a game. And so like, I'm telling them no. And now I've got the assistant coach and the strength coach saying, no. And if he sees them, he's like, nope. And so I think that's important, because as professional as you want to be, as much as you want to harness sports science, it's also a matter of educating the players and focusing on that rest and recovery during different periods of the year.
Yeah, and as you spoke to a little bit earlier, at the beginning of the conversation, for me, I've always tried to make sure that we're communicating with our strength and conditioning coach every single day. You and I had tons of conversations, and I think, the typical questions, I feel like I was doing a lot of the question asking, in just terms of, okay, these are the techniques that we're using. How can we develop those within the strength and conditioning side? And then also just the rest and recovery piece, like he was speaking to a little bit earlier. And, where are our athletes at different points during the week, based off when we're going to be playing games, and what are we doing in the weight room because of that. We did something a little bit different this year. I brought it to our strength and conditioning coach, and he liked the idea. And I can't say that I, took it, I came up with it myself. I took it from the Illinois coach, and we went to 4 days a week lifting, and we would only go about a half hour each of those days right before practice. And one of the reasons we did that was we didn't want to start and stop them twice during the day. And we also felt that with only having a roster of 10, you're looking at loading them up for a 45-minute to an hour workout and then a 2-hour practice. And we just felt like that might be a little bit much during the season. And so we went to half-hour lifts, basically getting them all ready. And then we would go straight into practice probably about 10 minutes after that.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. That's kind of one of the things that that I've been toying with a lot. Ironically, I was thinking about this the other night, Matt, and I was thinking about what I do differently for you guys in season. And I think I would have encouraged more lifts and less time for that very reason, and then just undulate the stressors and match them up to practice, which is, I think, something that Max and Kyle both referred to as well. That concept of consolidating stressors, I believe, so I'm trying to remember who it was. Kyle, you said you've periodized your whole practice plan in advance, right? What does that kind of look like for you? And this is something on my end that I have a lack of knowledge on, but how are we periodizing soccer or any sport practice? And how is that kind of like looking in terms of like what you're doing on a given day and how it progresses or regresses or whatever it is you're going to do?
Yeah, and I'll be clear, I'm not an expert on this. I need to study Portuguese to become an expert, but it's this idea of a tactical periodization. And essentially it takes the same periodization concepts that like Tudor Bampa would talk about, right? And it applies it to soccer and says that soccer is this complex system of events that we cannot control, but we can find guiding principles. And so our goal is to always train these principles. And so each session is focusing on a holistic approach. You're not separating out tactical, physical, psychological, and all that. You're saying we're training the whole player every single time, every activity, every session. And so each session will have kind of like, maybe the topic is I'm building from the back using my wing players to generate space. But within that topic, right, I can say, okay, I need certain physical stressors and I want to focus on power development. So if I'm doing that, my prime activity where I'm timing intervals, I'm making sure that we're not getting over fatigued, is going to be 3v3 or 4v4, because that's going to deal with a lot of short, quick movements. And so they're going to need adequate recovery. And those short, quick movements are going to correspond more to like a power output. So if I'm going to the strength coach, I'm saying, hey, this is a power day. Like, let's not have you do aerobics, you know? And then obviously I could teach the same concept, like building out of the back, same thing, and say, yeah, 77 is my approach. And if I'm doing that, you know, I can still moderate the intensity, whether I want 50% effort or 75 or 90% based on the number of intervals, the duration of the intervals, and the recovery period, just like you would any weight training session. But that 77 is going to correspond more to either like a power endurance or an aerobic capacity type workout. And so it can be a nightmare to plan on the soccer side, because first you have to determine what the hell is 100%, right? And obviously your fitness level at the beginning of the season is going to be different from the middle, from the end. And so what's 100% in a 3v3 activity or 4v4 activity or 11v11 at the start, the middle, the end? And it can be painful, but for me, I think as a coach, I have to honor like that idea, like the sports science idea. I wouldn't ask a kid to go in and bench press 50 times until they die and say, oh, we're doing 3 sets of 3 or 4 sets of 8, and here's your recovery period. And so everything I do is like, it's timed. And when the beeper goes off, if I haven't seen what I wanted or gotten my coaching point out, that's my issue. But the guys need a break because they have another bout of exercise. And I think that as soccer coaches, we need more people viewing it through that lens, through a sports science lens. And then we also need more people saying, like, we can't separate the tactical and physical. It's all one event, right? And we have to be able to be good enough, astute coaches to be able to train all of those things at the same time.
And from a soccer standpoint, Kyle, I mean, you're talking about small-sided games, right? A lot of small-sided game environments where on the soccer specific side of things, you know, you talk about you can't separate the physical and the technical or tactical, right? For soccer, the small-sided game is exactly how we're able to, in a lot of situations, merge the two, right? But as Kyle said, every small-sided game is so complex with every movement you make, for whether it's sharp or rest and recovery, and there's rest and recovery moments, there's intensity moments, and there's everything in between. And it can make it challenging from a planning standpoint, because then of course you've got how the durations and the intervals, but also that's what I love about the soccer piece of it, because you can also make it yours, right? And you can kind of find your style, and but that's also the challenge from the soccer standpoint, is just how incredibly complex just a 3v3 game can be from all those standpoints. So
yeah.
And I was thinking a little bit, going back to the communication piece, you know, a lot of times we talk about, you know, coaches and strength and conditioning coaches chatting, but I think it's also important to talk to the athletes. And I know for us, every day before practice, we're getting a physical and mental check on them and seeing where they're at and communicating that with the coaches as well.
Matt, I know you do quite a bit of data-driven stuff, and you do a lot of video analysis. I remember that from UMW. I'm not sure if that's continued at Hopkins, but I assume that it has, at least to some extent. But I also feel like you do a great job tapping into how your players are feeling. Like I've seen what you do post-practice with them and kind of debrief them after things and really get a feel for like what they're thinking while they're on the court. And the fact that you've managed to like marry those two things together really well, I think is really important, because a lot of times, especially nowadays, it seems like there's this data-driven craze where we just look at a tablet and think it's just going to give us all the answers. And yet you've managed to kind of understand that there's two pieces to that.
Yeah. So, you know, when our players come in at the beginning of practice, we have a whiteboard and we allow them to put on the whiteboard how they're feeling. We ask them to put a number, and then with that number, if it's a little bit lower, let us know what it specifically is bothering them. And the one benefit we really found was on the athletic training side. And so, you know, when the athletic trainers are coming into practice, they're looking at this board, and maybe there's a player or two that haven't gone to the athletic trainer, and now they're seeing this on the board and they're pulling that athlete aside and saying, hey, what's going on? And, you know, now we're getting that checked a little bit better than maybe before, where I don't think the athletes necessarily avoiding going to the trainer, but maybe they just felt like it wasn't a big thing and were able to take care of that pretty quick. And then, we've done a couple different things. We have a Vertec that we bring into the gym, and sometimes at different points in practice at the very beginning, different days, starting at different points with different days, we'll have them jump on that to see if their numbers are lower than they were before. And, if we're getting a couple inches lower than they were, there's some fatigue going on potentially that, we're not knowing about. We've also used the Vert training system. I don't know if you guys have seen that. And we would track the number of jumps in practice. Now, we didn't do that at Hopkins, but we had that at Mary Washington. And, certain positions would get to, a higher number, and we would shut them down in practice from jumping anymore. So, we've been able to use data, but then also, like you said, we've really talked to the athletes and making sure that they're good to go.
Yeah. And then back to your point too, Kyle, you're talking about kind of expanding the size of a field, or you're starting smaller, maybe a 3v3, 4v4, and then going to 7v7. From what rang in my mind there is you're just changing constraints in terms of size or space to work with those things. And at least for me as a strength coach, I think if we're condensing the size of something, we're probably increasing like the intensity in terms of the amount of change of direction that's going on. Decelerations and accelerations. And that obviously to me is probably maybe like at the tippy top of the intensity scale when we're talking about practice. Maybe you guys disagree. If you do, I'd love to hear. But is that kind of how you look at things? And Matt, maybe you do as well. I don't know if you do anything to manipulate the size of your environment. But I was just very curious about that in terms of, for me, like Kyle said, if I know we're hitting like a 3v3, like really small space or small-sided type of game, I know right away that I am going to target power more. I want to consolidate my stressors and do the same thing in the weight room on that given day. And I just wanted to know what the key factors in determining what makes something higher intensity for you guys in practice is.
Yeah, and I think that you're right on the money there, Jack. The smaller space, the more soccer actions you're generating. And so when I'm talking tactical periodization, the idea with it is it's going to take into account the physical components and all those stressors. But if you're doing more soccer actions, it's also a mental stressor. And we want the players to be functioning at a cognitively high level so that everything we're telling them has an impact. And it's not just going through one ear and out the other. So the smaller space, the more of those stressors are there, unless you find a way to minimize that intensity. And I think that the way in which you coach in that environment can change it, right? So if you're maybe as the season goes on, it becomes a lot of fun to go 4v4 to goal. But if you make sure that, it's a little bit of a hunt to find a ball every now and then, you're limiting the time, but the guys are still having fun. And so you're limiting, even though that space is conducive to a lot of soccer actions, you can limit it by just not having balls as available. But if you want it more intense, you have guys around the perimeter and it's nonstop. So I think that there are a bunch of ways to limit it, but really the size and the numbers, right? That's what's going to be the biggest factor.
Yeah,
and sorry, go on, Matt.
Oh no, go ahead, Max.
Well, just continuing from the soccer side, it's I would also say on those small-sided games, we talked about how we can control the point of entry, right? In terms of where a ball is going to drive from every single time a sequence starts, right? And I would say for us, I can change the way I try to change the intensity of a small-sided game for players that are participating. Yes, is the numbers, but also I just harp and focus on transitional moments, right? Moments from when now the ball went out of play and what's the point of entry and how does it restart, right? Or is when a ball goes out of bounds, is that a transitional moment where all of a sudden we've got a new ball that immediately enters because we've got ball servers? Is there a transitional piece where we've played games where even as the ball exits the field, it's neither team's ball. It is a race to go get that ball, right? And then, of course, the intensity is just spiked for those guys surrounding the ball. And then we can continue playing. And also, everybody's attention spans don't stop either, right? The stressor of the ball is actually still live, even though it's not, right? And it just kind of prolongs the intensity level of the small-sided game. So, and obviously, on the soccer side, very much so gone are the days of streamlined running from a conditioning standpoint and stuff like that. And these small set of games are the way we're doing it. And it's in line with what U.S. soccer is doing and everything across the board. So.
Yeah.
And I think for volleyball, it's a little bit different. I want to say when we get into like the 3v3s or the 4v4s, a lot of time, even though they're getting more contacts, the intensity's lower. Because once you get into the 6v6, middles are going from pin to pin, blocking. Usually there's harder transitions that are taking place. So for us, we use the small sided games to get extra contacts, and then we use the 6v6, our normal gameplay, to really amp up the intensity. And I think for us last year, with only having a roster of 10, we weren't able to do a whole lot of 6v6, but we did do some 6v4 and 5v5, things like that. And we would cut that back our practice times. Like typically we like to go 2, maybe 2.5 every now and then. And last year we were between hour and a half and maybe 2 hours at times. If it was earlier in the week and we had a few days between games, but so I think it's for a matter of roster management as well and what you can do.
Yeah, I think your point to like the condensed practice time is an important one, because I know in the soccer world there's still some old school coaches who are like, it's got to be 2 hours and we're going to get everything in. But to me, like paying attention to what they're able to cognitively take in each session, you have to say the topic is limited so that we actually understand that topic. And then if you're moderating the intensity and managing that effectively, you could have a great session in 45 minutes, an hour 15. It depends on what your goals are. Not enough coaches, I think, look at that as an option. And because you can always use the film room or a recovery session after to like say, no, we still want them focused and working for a certain amount of time, but our sessions don't have to go on and on and on.
Well, and we talked about the stressors of just college athletes, right? And I know for here at VMI, I mean, my goodness, our guys have a lot on their plate, right? And for us, being as time efficient as possible, yes, from a rest recovery and strength training standpoint is important, but even just for the livelihood, right? In my opinion, happy and players that feel fulfilled, right? And enjoying what they're doing every second, every day, and every session we step into is almost the most important thing for results and relationships and a healthy organization and a healthy program. And I think one of the easiest ways to manage that maybe sometimes is less talked about, just because, as Kyle said, there's just sometimes the concept of just you've got a 2-hour time slot for practice and a coach says, well, hell, I'm going to use every minute of that, right? When in reality, that's actually kind of productive. So
I liked what you guys are talking about too, with like Kyle, you were saying transition them over to film or something like that. I always found that when I've observed athletes practicing, like, let's be honest, I don't think a lot of them enjoy practice. So if we could find a way, one, to make it more enjoyable, like we're talking about, and then two, have those transitional moments into something else, maybe where you're even off the pitch, off the court, in the film room, you spend 15 minutes looking at that. I think even having transitions like that, we as humans crave some novelty and changes in our environment from time to time. So while I think structure is great, we have to find a way to marry a little bit of unpredictability in there to keep people invested.
Jack, I think it's a good point, as it also keeps them, I think, stimulated, right? Where when you get into the doldrums of every day, training, right? The ability to change the rhythm. And don't get me wrong, I'm all about structure and rhythm, and Matt and Jack can attest to that. But at the same time, I think there's tons of value to making sure guys are stimulated, and changing up the rhythm can be an important piece. And for me as a young coach, that's something I've had to learn over the years, and obviously got a lot more to learn, but the value of changing that rhythm. So, I mean, I agree.
Yeah, I think it's important too, that especially at the college level, one of our duties as a coach is to help these players understand that they're developing some lifelong skills in there. And so on my end, something I'm going to focus on and probably sacrifice maybe my own coaching ability to a degree, like, is let's make sure they have time to work on whatever they need to individually every single day. And so that may mean I might want to go an hour and a half, but if that's our time slot on the field, I've got to go an hour 10 or an hour to make sure that they can do that. And I think it shows faith in the coach that your players are going to work. It teaches them how to work and recognize their strengths and weaknesses and how to work together to improve them. So I think from a team chemistry side, that can be really impactful and effective. And obviously from an individual development side, because when we're talking small-sided games, you're getting all these soccer actions and all these decisions, but you are never specifically focusing on technical skill development, right? You might coach it or say, hey, receive across your body. But if I am not that good at it, I might need 100, 150 reps on my own to do that. So setting time aside to do that could be beneficial. Or the film where it's like, maybe I'm a great technical player, but my decision-making sucks. And if we can do a film session that focuses in on how am I seeing what's going on around me and teach me better ways to recognize and engage with space, that can be really effective as well. So many tools we have.
Yeah, agreed. And I would take it even one or two steps further. I mean, obviously we're in the era of Zoom right now, right? And we're trying to operate with our teams through virtual means. And, you know, for us, we talked about stressors. Oftentimes there's a lot of schoolwork to be done. And, you know, reading another book might just be more work and another stressor, right? But the ability to teach cultural concepts and change the rhythm through different readings and different ideas and the presentation of ideas. And then, you know, to give you guys a little bit of a look into our program, I mean, this coming Thursday, we're doing a men's soccer trivia night, right? Just to change the rhythm of in the week to week of what we're doing. But also you can use those clever things to further educate your players, right? On how an NCAA tournament works, right? And how we qualify for those things. Where oftentimes I think coaches sometimes don't even talk or educate their players as much on that stuff, because we love the sport, don't get me wrong, and we want to coach, we want to be on the field or on the court, but also having a program and players that are educated on some of that stuff and they don't even realize they're taking the time to learn it, right, is usually the best part. So
again, this is another thing that's interesting to me. You guys we get athletes and we're talking about what I think is like really great, like we're moving forward with what's going on here in this very discussion, you know, very progressive in a lot of ways, especially away from like old school coaching. But I find too, like, we want the athletes to be invested in this. But if you guys like run into issues when doing this, where Kyle, for example, you said like this kid needs to work on this specific technical thing on his own time, like in practice in this little time I've carved out. Has it taken a while to kind of build that culture where guys are going to take it upon themselves to get better at those things? Or are you just getting the right type of player in immediately and that's happening? And I'm sure it kind of varies across the board, but how do you like view understanding that, like, yes, I know all these things, I can provide the player with the option to do it his or herself, but it's ultimately on them to like embrace that path of self-discovery and get better at, for example, these technical elements?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes to everything. It's a challenge. It's about generating that culture. It's about getting lucky. And to me as a coach, it's about being flexible and viewing myself not as someone who's there to manage performance, but as someone who's there to teach somebody to manage their performance, and to recognize that when I was a player, I spent most of my time injured because my coach was not up on like the sports science. And so there's this idea of like, build that mental gritty edge. But if you have someone who's already got that, they run themselves into the ground and they're injured. And so you've lost a good player. And so my thought is, I've told the guys this, like, well, you can stay after, but if you have a pressing matter, go handle that. And my expectation is that eventually everyone is going to embrace it because their team's going to hold them accountable. Or the ones who aren't going to embrace it, they're going to get left behind. And you know, that's their personal choice at that moment. You know, when you've been provided opportunities, facilities, equipment, and a time slot where you have other teammates and peers engaging in that activity, if you choose to step away from that, it takes some resolve, right? You have to really be committing to not be committed. And if you've chosen that path, then it'll be clear. Your playing time will suffer. But again, like I tell my guys, like the best player on the field, if he's like, no, I'm not going to do that because my body hurts, he's not going to do that. And he's probably still going to be the best player on the field because he knows what his body needs. When I coached semi-pro up in Duluth, Minnesota, we were preparing for national tournament against Detroit FC. And we were going to play in front of 8,000 fans. And our captain, who's one of our best players, he played grueling minute after grueling minute. In that 2 weeks leading up to that playoff game, he trained twice. And he wasn't injured, but he was just feeling a little run down. And he's like, I'll come out to sessions, I'll watch. But he needed that. And he scored, I think, 2 goals in that game. We lost. But he put in the time years in advance that his body needed something, his mind needed something. And as a coach, I think if we're willing to not manage the player, but provide them with the tools to manage themselves and be willing to accept that, right? And sometimes it has great payoff and other times you get screwed. But if we're willing to accept that, I think more often than not, you're going to see players really embrace that culture and hold each other accountable to working smarter, working more efficiently.
And I would say going along with that, we talk to our players about being proactive in their own growth. And, soccer, depending on how many coaches they have, their roster's, twice the size of ours? And so if they have 1 or 2 coaches and they're dealing with 26 plus athletes, they don't have that time individually to work with them every single day and just put that focus on one individual. And so, we're even that way in the volleyball world, 1 or 2 coaches up to 17, 18. And so for us, we try to make sure that we take time once a week with each one individually for about 10 or 15 minutes, and they come in and they'll do film. But we don't just, we've kind of flipped it a little bit, where I think in the past, you find coaches will go, they'll look at film, they'll cut the film, and then they'll bring the player in and they'll tell them all the things that they want them to get better at. And it's a double-edged sword, right? Because they're giving them information, but at the same token, you're pretty much telling them all the things they're not very good at. And so what we flipped was we have them go find the things that they want to work on, and then they bring that back to us. And then now we're collaborating with them and how to help them achieve their goals. And so you get a little bit more buy-in that way because it's things they want to work on. And then once they hit the things they want to work on, now they're looking for more and they're asking you, what else can I do to get better? And so now all that stuff you wanted to give them right away, they're more receptive to. And so that's something that we did. And, our players have given us great feedback on it.
Yeah, that sounds like an awesome way, Matt, to drive engagement and make sure that players feel like they have a real active role in their development. Yeah, that's awesome. I think I'll have to try that this season.
Well, and it also works well for those that maybe don't think about putting in that extra time or never really have watched film. You make it where you're telling them they need to, but then once they see the benefit of it, they buy into it and they're like, oh, this isn't so bad. Like, I like this. And, for our starters, they can use game film, and we film every practice. And so what we do is those that aren't starting, we ask them to look at practice film. And that way everybody's still being involved in the process. And it's not just if you're playing, you're getting better. And if you're not playing, you're not.
Nice.
Not that if you're not playing, you're not, but you know what I mean? Like the players see it as, well, I don't have game film to watch, so why watch film?
Oh no, I've had players say that to us before, right? At different institutions I've worked at, as well as here. And from a soccer standpoint, this spring, before kind of everything that occurred in the world, when we were still training, was the first time I think this program in a while has filmed practices, right? And I don't know if we were with the end goal that Matt was so able to kind of fluently say. But no, it's a great piece of advice. And I think that's a big deterrent to maybe the players that need to watch the film most is, well, coach, I'm not even on the film, right? Which it's a great point. And from a soccer standpoint, Matt made the point of, obviously just bodies, right? We tend to have more bodies, and it can be more difficult to do maybe some of that individual reference. And I think coaches just gotta, again, we talked about being time efficient. You just got to be as clever as you can. So we do a lot of small group stuff, even from the technical standpoint that Kyle's talking about. I would say for us, because of the way VMI is and how unique of a university it is, I don't know if I always have that additional time to give, right? Just because of the hours in a day, right? So we actually start reverting to a lot of small group, positional oriented, position specific stuff where maybe we can hit that technical point that Kyle knows this one individual needs, but hearing it's going to benefit the group at large, right? And when I say the group at large, I mean that position at large, the center forwards at large or something like that. So, and we've gone that direction with film at points as well. But yes, that's kind of been our solution. And again, I always lean on how unique we are as a university, but you know, everybody's got their challenges. It's just who's clever enough to find the solutions, you know?
And I think going off of what Max was saying with the small group instruction is also you're talking about this and maybe you're hitting that one or two individuals that need a specific technique, but now that group is also helping that individual because they're going to watch it in practice. And you know, and a lot of times maybe even that individual that's working on that piece is going to ask their teammates, hey, can you watch me in this area? And so now they're working together, and you know, there's more coaching eyes, so to speak, on that individual player,
which you could argue would create some leaders as well. No,
I think it should.
So Kyle, you mentioned earlier too the mental toughness piece, and I've always find that very interesting because I think it's a very vague, quite honestly, it's a bullshit concept in my opinion, because it could be anything. And I feel like it's just kind of blanketed over what could be almost any issue. I'm curious, when you guys are getting to know your players and evaluating them, is that kind of terminology something that's present for you guys? Or if not, like what are kind of you looking at in terms of developing your athletes? If you perceive there to be a disconnect somewhere, are you attributing it to that mental toughness component, or are you kind of trying to dig deeper and understand there's going to be like some layers to that concept?
I think for me, like I struggle with the whole idea of mental toughness. I'm with you, Jack. I think it's a bit of bullshit. When I was assistant coach this past year, the head coach at one point, he wanted to get them mentally tough, and they ran like 14 50-yard dashes in 5 minutes. And he didn't get them mentally tough. He got them ready to kill him. And I think that as coaches, we have to move away from that. Yes, like at some point, sports psychology enters in, but maybe that's not something I'm most qualified to deal with. And so I might need to find help on that to really understand what's going on with a specific player. And I think with limited resources, what I'm going to focus on isn't like, are my guys like mentally tough? Can they push through this? Can I train them physically? Remember the Titan style and miracle and all that crap. It's, can I teach them effectively, responsibly, and make sure that at the end of the day, they're still healthy. Because if I'm able to do that, I'm going to, you know, be able to make sure that they have a solid foundation so that when we do encounter adversity, we're entering from a position of strength. And obviously everything I'm saying right now is still kind of vague, but it's one of those things. I think that it does depend on players. And that's where like what Max was saying, like comes down to how efficient are we as a coach? How good are we at recognizing or gaining data from players about how they're feeling, what's going on with their family? Did a cat die? Are they having emotional issues, and addressing those from a standpoint of compassion and understanding, but not with a goal of generating mental toughness, but with the goal of saying, I'm going to meet each player where he or she is and help them through whatever situation they're encountering. Because I don't think blanket approaches work. I mean, you treat a star player, even at the pro level, differently, right? Not necessarily because he's a star, but because he has different things going on in his life, right? You treat a role player differently than other role players because of who that individual is. So to me, it's got to be as individualized as time will allow. frequent conversations. Like Matt, you saying you try and meet with each player weekly, I think is amazing. And that's something like I'm resolved to do this year. We're going to carry a roster of close to 40 guys. But to me, brutal. And I don't have a full-time assistant.
Might be one every 3 weeks.
Hold on. I think I'll probably make a list of like 10 to 12 guys to call and chat with for 3 minutes each day. And just say, hey, how's it going? And checking in so that they understand, like, yeah, they might not see playtime. I might not make a coaching point to them in training, but I know they exist. I know what their strengths are, and I'm aware of their weaknesses. And I think that is far more important than trying to create mentally tough players, because what does that even mean?
Yeah, and I think when you think about mentally tough, right, you think of certain athletes specifically. You know, like for me, I would think of like Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan, things of that nature. But the qualities that a lot of them emulate were more to be along the lines of they were confident and they were well prepared. And so for me, I want my players to always feel confident going to the match because they're well prepared and they know what to expect and they've been able to execute it in practice. And going off what Kyle said, like running them to death just to try to see if they're tough enough to be on your squad or that they're going to fight. You know, you tell me to go run a whole lot, I'm not going to be that motivated, but you put me in a game situation and ask me to win that game, I'm going to go after it. So I think it's creating an environment that allows them to grow as athletes and be prepared and then gain that confidence over time to go out there and when they're on the court, they're not even worried about it. So it could be a pressure moment, but to them, they've done it 100 times in practice already. And I think that's what it's about. When I think of mental toughness, those are two things that I think about. And being relentless. We talk about that a lot, is just going after it all the time. And regardless of score or regardless of, you know, how we're feeling in terms of, you know, if we're feeling a little bit down, we're still going to go after it. You know, but not, of course not if they're physically hurt or anything like that.
Yeah. And if you align mental toughness with like physical adversity, to me, and you're picking physical adversity that is not task specific, right? Like you're talking about right here. I fail to see how an athlete draws a connection and gets tougher. Like I just don't get that, you know. So
no, and Jack, it's interesting because for me, I relate the mental toughness piece solely to the emotional, right? Not so much the physical. And for us, a constant thing I'm saying in training is, you know, like be mentally strong enough, be mentally tough enough to just get over it. And I'm not talking about how fast you just ran that sprint, right? What I'm talking about is are you mentally, like the amount of players I see these days that come out of club soccer with bad habits of every time I don't complete a pass, I have this adverse reaction, right? Or I throw my hands up in the air, or I curse, or whatever, right? Meanwhile, play continues and we've lost 2 seconds on a transition. So there's the technical piece we're losing. But don't get me wrong, maybe they did have a bad day, right? So I think it's the balance of, at the end of training, can you put the arm around that player and have that conversation that Kyle's talking about? But in the moment, can we compartmentalize so we also make sure we perform and also enjoy ourselves on the field and compartmentalize those things? And Kyle, you were talking about, you know, size of squad. We're around 30. But what I found interesting is you talked about calling them up as well. And I think that's awesome. And it shows the personal touch, something we've started to do here as well, because again, time is of the essence. It's about a 3.5 minute walk from the locker room to our training field. Multiply that by 2. That's about 7 minutes you have before and after practice where you can communicate with 3 or 4 or 5 guys, you know, and we've started to try to value that and multiply that by maybe 2, 3, 4 staff members, however many you have. Now you've connected with 15 guys. Maybe that's a little audacious, but you get what I'm getting at, right? Like your ability and using time to connect. So that would just be something I'd say to that. So.
We get it. You're in D1. You have multiple assistants.
No.
Just kidding, man. Just kidding. One of the last things I wanted to focus on, since we seem to be transitioning over towards the physical realm, what are some things, like you guys have been in a lot of places, and I assume like you all have worked with different strength coaches and whatnot, and have accumulated some knowledge on that side of things. What are some fitness qualities for you that are really important and that you feel maybe could be better addressed by the strength coach so that the approach is more streamlined?
I think it's really tough, at least in soccer, to give a general answer. I have a center mid who's incredibly dynamic, agile, side lateral movements incredible. And he's texting me, coach, I need to get faster. What are exercises I can do? I'm like, you actually don't need to do anything except stay healthy. But then I have a kid who might want to be a winger, and we have a winger who can run 10 70s in a row and still be the fastest guy on the field. So for him, it's if you want to compete there, you do need to get faster. And so I almost think it depends position to position. But that's, unless you have the resources as a strength coach and are working with the staff, I think that's brutal to try and work through. And so I think it falls on the coach to kind of say, look, here are guys who kind of fall into different categories as far as their needs, because you see them play and it's so for me, I talked through each player with the strength coach and say, look, you can give them anything that's general. They all need to work on their foundational strength, their foundational movement skills, developing a base so they can generate more power and speed and repetitive power and speed. But I don't care if this kid ever improves in his weightlifting numbers, because he's perfect the way he is. And if you look on the soccer side, Neymar, he came out a skinny little dude, and when Barcelona, PSG, they say we're keeping your ratios from upper body to core to lower body the same. So every workout you do is going to be a full body complex chain workout, because we don't want you changing anything. It'd be like if you're asking Steph Curry to put on 10 pounds, it could throw off his shooting mechanics. And the skill is so much more important. So make sure Steph's ankles are stable by transitioning his movement structure to his hips. And I think that for me, it's got to depend on the role the player plays in the game, right? And in soccer, you have probably 4 or 5 different needs, right? From guys who are going up and down to guys who are just doing short bursts to guys who are primarily lateral, and then guys who need to be more physical and stronger. And you have those dynamics. And God bless a strength coach if he's willing to come up with individualized or role-based patterns for that, but most likely not. So I think it's more, for me at least, it's managing the expectations of the strength coach and saying, I'm okay if this guy shows minimal improvement, as long as he's respecting you and taking it seriously and staying healthy. Whereas this guy, I want to see a 20% increase because he needs this. And so it's, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as certainly position specific, even within volleyball, when you have your attackers on the front line and, they need those big explosive dynamic movements, but then you have your liberos in the back who really don't jump at all. And they're more about quickness and being stable. And this with me, Jack, is I never tried to say that I'm an expert in this field in any way. I know my coaching role, and I utilize my strength and conditioning coaches and ask for their knowledge, and I put a lot of trust in them because I know how hard they've trained and the vast knowledge that they have. So for me, it's more or less just asking our strength and conditioning coach, hey, what do you need out of this player? And how can we help and support that? And I think as coaches, sometimes we tend to be the ones giving all the information and telling what we want and how we want it. And, there's a lot of type A personalities in our field. And I think it's important to be able as a coach to step back and just say, hey, what do you need from us? And what do you need from our athletes? And how can we support that? And the other thing we always try to do is see if the strength and conditioning coach has time, which normally they may or may not, because they're taking care of 20 teams for one coach, especially the D3 level. And Jack, you've been a part of that. Is if they can come into a practice and just watch the athletes move. And I know you were able to do that a few times, and we were able to find deficiencies from your expertise, just watching them move in a way or jump and hey, why are they loading that way when we need to work on whatever piece it might be within their jumping mechanics. So that's a little bit soapbox, I would suppose, as I'm going off a little bit here. But for me, I always default to the strength and conditioning coach.
But I totally agree with Matt, because it's not necessarily my specific background and whatnot, but I always call our strength and conditioning coach our expert in that regard, right? And I think there's a lot of coaches in general at the college level that almost start to insert themselves in the work of the strength coach when maybe that's not necessarily their background, right? And that can kind of make the waters a little murky and maybe mix the message in terms of what's being presented to players, which, as we've talked about, the amount on players' plate and how customized things ideally could be and should be. And my goodness, if we can make it simple and effective in the weight room and allow our strength and conditioning coaches to be our experts for us, as long as we have proper communication and can express what we're looking for from the technical and the tactical and the soccer, or just the sport side of things, as Matt's saying. And, Jack, to answer your original question, Kyle obviously made the point that there isn't a one-fit-all answer, right, when it comes to that. And I think I totally agree there isn't. But over my years in coaching, I've tried to find the one-word answer that obviously isn't going to do a very good job, right? But I always say, at a base level, if I feel like we're making our guys simply more athletic on a day-to-day basis, of course, look, there needs to be rest, there needs to be recovery, there's periodization, et cetera, right? And again, it's not a great answer, but it's the best I could find for the blanket answer, right? Is if we're simply making our guys more athletic, that's going to help us on the soccer side of things, and obviously Division I soccer and certainly the athleticism pieces that come with that. But and don't get me wrong, totally agree with what Kyle said about the customization, and we think about all those things, we do all those things, but for the blanket answer, that's what I would say.
Has the landscape, because you guys have been in the game now for a while, have athletes changed physically when you inherit them from wherever they came from over the past 10 or so years? Like, what's changed, or has nothing changed?
On
just
the volleyball,
general physical qualities, I would say.
On the volleyball side, I mean, I know club teams are getting a little bit more into adding strength and conditioning, but it's a very minimal base. And I think, Jack, you had worked at our club in Fredericksburg, and, I mean, that's kind of the introduction they're getting to it. We honestly, we see our biggest growth in the change in the athletes once they hit, college and get in the weight room. And I've seen almost a consistent pattern of that probably over the last 10 years. I don't think that's changed a whole lot, at least on the volleyball side. Maybe soccer could be a little bit different. They can speak to that. And we also collected data on it, right? So we were able to see, certain maxes, and we wouldn't necessarily do 1 rep maxes for certain skills, but we were able to take their strength and calculate it that if they hit a certain percentage, you saw that their verticals were in a specific number. I'm not going to give all that information out. We did all that, but so I for us, we know the value of it. But yeah, I don't think I've seen a big change in the athletes, so to speak, on the volleyball side, on the women's volleyball side.
I think from a soccer standpoint, I would say over the last, 10, 11 years in college soccer as coach, as player, et cetera, I would say, I think our athletes, when they come in as first years, are a little bit more, let's say, familiar and whether it be through home gym experiences or just simply knowing that college soccer has all these physical demands. So they're trying to do some level of lifting before they come in and strength and conditioning work. So I think every year what I'm finding is just a higher percentage of guys coming in as first years have some familiarity, some commitment to some technique. Whereas I think 10 years ago, it was less that. So
yeah, I would agree 100% on that.
I just think it's interesting because I agree with both of your guys' assessment on that. But for soccer, and I played other sports in high school. I didn't do soccer. And so like football and wrestling were kind of 2 of my sports. And so if you wanted to play, you'd better get your numbers up, right? Because that had a correspondence to how much speed you were able to gain. And speed was an integral part of those games. Whereas I look at soccer and, when we did testing throughout college, I always performed in the top 2 or 3 on the team, but I wasn't a starter. because I wasn't quite good enough. And I look at even my team now, I have some guys who are athletic freaks and some who aren't. And some of those guys who aren't are my best players, right? And you have a mix. And I think if they're trying to get to the next level, they have to become more and more athletic. But maybe that doesn't correspond to the weight room for some of them. And I'm thinking in particular of a kid he's never lifted weights, and yet his lateral shifting ability and balance with that and power and explosiveness is unreal. And so was that developed naturally? Was that developed through the game, which is an athletic activity? I just struggle with this because my bent has always been like, if I'm going to equalize, I have to get stronger. I have to get faster, probably bigger, right? But I'm seeing like plenty of players who completely eschew that. And so the weight room can potentially make them better, but if it comes at the sacrifice of them and their skill, then it might not. And so it's just I have no idea on what the hell that means, but I just think it's interesting, particularly in soccer, where I'm looking at like some of the guys who are spending the most time focusing on that are not the best players.
It's so interesting you mentioned that too, Kyle, because this is honestly something that I talk about on the podcast a lot with all my guests. I think the weight room has a lot of limitations, especially for certain athletes at certain points in their career. I think when you have someone that doesn't have like you mentioned, foundational movement, or like maybe a foundational aerobic capacity or something like that, if you inherit a player like that, then yes, I think the weight room can be very beneficial for them early on. But after a certain point, I think we see diminishing returns on what we put into the weight room. And a lot of what goes on in the weight room as we reach for higher and higher task-specific performance numbers in the weight room leads to a lack of athleticism in some cases if we go down that rabbit hole too far. Because what is max effort lifting? I mean, if you're looking along a continuum of like fluidity of movement, it's not close to the fluid side of things, you know? So that's a big deal in my opinion. I think it is important that we learn to brace and build strength and have some connective tissue resiliency from lifting. But at a certain point, I think it does start to become less effective or less useful. So I think that's a brilliant point.
Now, Jack, have you found, because I feel like I found this when we would track our athletes at Mary Washington, you see huge gains freshman and sophomore year, significant gains. Junior year, they seem to almost reach their maximum. And then senior year, it's a little bit more of just maintaining them because their bodies are breaking down a little bit from just the wear and tear of being an athlete. And I know for us, we kind of really want to develop our freshmen and sophomores, and then on the back end, make sure that our athletes are staying healthy and maintaining their strength, but not necessarily, like you said, trying to go to that one next step, because now they're really overloading their bodies on top of being an athlete to try to reach maybe 10 more pounds.
Yeah, I think you're 100% correct. Specifically with like, I think your sport in general too, the amount of wear and tear that happens from jumping is insane. And if you've developed a girl's performance to be as high as, for example, like Savs was the year I was there. I mean, I think she and Peyton hit like 30 inches on a just jump, or it was like just short of 30 inches on a vertical. Like, I mean, these girls are already 6 feet tall. So like, very well-trained athletes, but once you start reaching performance that is that high, to me, I'm viewing performance and health on a continuum. And if we've moved that far down, the continuum on the performance side, it is going to come at the expense of health. And at a certain point, we have to know when to kind of rein in some of the general development that's my lane, so that they are ready to go for your specific needs, on a game day and stuff like that. And I think it's a brilliant point. I mean, yeah, it's in the 4-year process of developing a college athlete, after a certain point, specifically for non-football related sports where I think strength is just more important in something like football. It's time to kind of scale back a little bit. Again, depends on the athlete, but in general, it's time to scale back what we're doing from a performance standpoint in the weight room so that they're ready to go when they play.
And what I would also add is, I think, especially maybe when you're 1 or 2 years in and they've seen certain gains, or even somebody after their first year, right? I think it's important for coaches, and I don't know how much this conversation occurs, but to make sure that person's work in the weight room or from a strength and conditioning standpoint is still focused on performance, right? I think a lot of times players will start getting carried away with, we joke about the beach body or however you want to look at it, right? But they lose perspective just because either A, they enjoy the weight room that much and they're passionate about it, or B, they enjoy the gains that they're seeing. But we forget the whole point of why you're doing that, right? And it's hopefully to help you increase performance. And I think probably at all levels we battle it, but I certainly have a couple where it's not always just about the visual of how you look, right? It's making sure the performance side is still the end goal. So
yeah, I mean, having worked in all three of the four pro sports now, like I've just been exposed to so many different body types, and I'm working, all of them are elite. If you've reached professional sports, you're elite in my opinion. In a lot of ways. You might not be the LeBron or something like that, but you're an elite athlete compared to almost everyone else in the world. And I mean, you would be surprised some of the bodies you see. They don't look like they're built for performance, but they can perform, So that's a great point.
Well, I thought it was interesting too, when I was watching the Michael Jordan documentary, where the strength and conditioning coach mentioned how the training for baseball is completely different from the training from basketball, and the body types are different and what you're doing and how one's going to counteract the other. And I think that also goes to show the importance of having a strength and conditioning coach who can separate what this sport needs compared to what that sport needs and the individual athlete. And so I just thought that was a great reinforcer for all of you in that field.
Thank you. It was a nice moment. I was pretty happy when they talked about the strength coach.
I thought you had a real interesting point, Jack, about like the spectrum of performance and health. And I think that's something that, like, as coaches, if we can keep that in mind more, we'll probably achieve better performance. But that health perspective, you see so many athletes come out and they're broken down. And for years it's trying to, and I know I've been a part of this, trying to figure out how does my body actually work so that I can just be a normal human being and healthy,
Yeah, you're 100% right. And that's one thing, especially I think, when I was at Mary Wash too. And honestly, I think this applies in a lot of college cases. I think pro's a little different because this is your livelihood. I think the expectation is you're performing at such a high level. By the time you're done, you're just not going to feel great. Like, I hate to say it, but that's just kind of the reality, the nature of the beast. But if you're an athlete that doesn't have pro aspirations or isn't going to have the skill level, I really feel like the strength and conditioning coach's mission is to also help the sport coaches understand, there's life after college. And you cannot view the athlete as a vehicle to your success only. It is important, obviously, because job security, you guys need to keep your jobs, but we have to ensure that we understand that after a 4-year period, the athlete isn't completely broken down. We need to teach the athlete the value of scaling back, understanding how to maintain their health so that not only are they good after school, but by their senior year, they're also at their, maybe not at their best, but as close to their best as possible. And I think you see that fatigue, that senior fatigue from some players. I don't know if you guys want to shed any light on that, but you could just tell sometimes players are just done. They're just done their senior year and you don't get your best out of them because you asked for too much.
Well, we had a player this year at Hopkins who played the entire season. She had she had tore her labrum in her hip. And she played the entire season on a torn hip labrum. And we had to maintain and monitor that throughout the year. And there were times where, we were telling her hey, you can only practice 20 minutes. You get this amount of time, or you could do this much, or you're not allowed to jump today. And, and I think sometimes we forget as coaches, just the mental anguish on that player, not being able to practice and feeling like they're performing at the level they want to perform. And she did a great job with that. But I know there were days that were pretty tough on her emotionally, just because she's dealing with this pain and wanting to be able to do the things that she normally could do. I think it's important to keep that in mind too, that mental health component of those older players that are hurt. And Kyle might be able to speak to that since he said he was hurt most of the time. But
it's not easy, but I like what you're doing. To me, if the head coach says they're aware of the injury and I'm cutting you off, that takes a lot of the pressure off the player to come back beforehand. And I don't think enough coaches do that. I think there's an emphasis, and I've seen this from other coaches, like, it's just a little injury, come on back, you can push through. Whereas I think if we say, oh, you're injured, you cannot perform at your best ability, somebody else can, let's give them a chance, let's get you healthy and go through this cycle together. You could eliminate a lot of that mental anguish, perhaps.
I think some of that mental anguish is ultimately players just want to feel safe, right? They want to feel safe in their role. They want to feel valued. And I think what you both just said is ultimately making that player, despite injuries, despite health, and probably questioning their role and the anguish as you described. I mean, if you can make that player feel safe, I'm going to argue just from a mental health standpoint, they're going to recover even faster than physically as well. So
The brain is very powerful. It's crazy. If you perceive a lot of threat, then bad things are usually going to happen. And I think that's, for me anyways, like the biggest lesson I've taken away on the strength and conditioning side is like you have guys come in and they're not sure what to expect, or it's not familiar to some of them. And for me, it's like, I think the biggest change that I've had in the last couple of years, and I wish that I was able to understand this a little more even when I was at Mary Wash. I think I did a pretty good job of it overall anyways, but just getting athletes to understand, like, I'm here for you. I know this is maybe a foreign environment, but we're going to work together to get you some adaptations that you might want and to provide a space for you where you feel like you can let your guard down and allow some really cool things to happen in your body. You know, I always look at, like, for example, like everybody talks about KPIs, like key performance indicators, right? And they talk about, like, for me, it's like, oh, how much does someone back squat, or how much does someone do this? For me, I've changed what my KPIs look like. I actually call them like KPIs. So like I do a lot of eyeball stuff. So like I'm very into, cultivating linear speed. I think if you do that correctly in the weight room and dose it properly, you're going to eliminate a lot of potential injuries when the coaches say it's time to roll the balls out and play. And for me, I have an eye for understanding when certain shin angles need to be hit or something like that. And all I need to do is ask the athlete what it feels like, show them a little video like you guys have talked about in your practice sessions, and boom, these things start to line up for them, you know? And if they perceive threat, some of those KPIs involve like using the range of motion you have given to you on a specific thing. If you perceive threat, the brain's going to shut that down because it's going to crave stability. It's going to internalize, bring everything into the center, and it's not going to give you the range of motion you need, for example, in your appendicular skeleton. And I know it might sound a little hokey to some of the listeners, but it's something I've talked about a bunch of the podcasts before. So it's just kind of the way it is now for me. It's like, if I know and see you in a game being able to do something and you can't do it for me in the weight room, then that's a me thing. I have to change something about the environment to get you to open up, you know?
And I think for us too, one thing that we started to notice in our gym were some common, not necessarily injuries, but just kind of aches and pains. And so with working with our strength and conditioning coach and our athletic trainer, we kind of took a 3-pronged approach and made sure we were prehabbing before every practice. And one thing we did last year was if they went down for their 30-minute lift and say their lift, what they did was more lower body, then our prehab would be shoulders that day when they came into our gym before practice. And if they did a little more upper body and a little less lower body, then maybe we were prehabbing the ankles and the hips. And so we would just kind of counteract whatever they were doing to make sure they were fully prepared and cutting down on those things. Shin splints were always a huge one with our attackers. And I imagine in soccer, you get a lot of shin splints. And I think it's also educating the freshmen how important it is, as soon as that's starting to bug you, like go to the trainer, because they all feel like, oh, it's just something little. And then a week later, it's a full blown, shin splint. And, I don't know the time period, but it always seems like it's a week later. And, so we really emphasize any little ache and pain, talk to your trainer, talk to your strength and conditioning coach, make sure that's happening.
Well, and the most frustrating perspective is if I report this little niggling thing to my strength coach as well as my athletic trainer, coach isn't going to play me, right? So that's the immediate concern. But obviously, we work to change that quickly. But yeah.
Well, and I think that just comes down to the reaction the coach makes after all of that's taken place, right? So
Still want to feel safe, right?
if your athlete trusts, like, oh, like coach isn't going to bench me because he knows my shin's bothering me. He's going to try to make sure that I'm ready to play the game instead. I think you find a better culture in that.
Matt had no choice last year though because he had 2 players on his bench.
At one point, I had 1 sub.
Oh man,
down to 7.
I hate to do this, guys, but I know Max has to get out of here, so I think this will probably about wrap it up. But any closing thoughts from any of you on anything we discussed or something we didn't discuss that interests you?
No, I think this was great. I enjoyed being able to chat, and I think it's reassuring to see that other sports, because typically we talk with volleyball. Now Max and I would go to lunch all the time and chat, and usually that was philosophy and things like that. But it's nice to see that for an athlete, the same principles apply regardless of sport. You just work hard, communicate, trust, and and mental health. I think those are 4 big factors, and I think all 3 coaches hit upon those, which is cool to see.
Yeah.
No, go on, Kyle.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, just kind of to your point earlier, Matt, about needing as a coach, as a sport coach, to kind of cede some of your power, if you will, to the strength and conditioning coach and say, look, you're the expert in this. And my thought has always been, and I'm a former personal trainer, but the more that a sports-specific coach can kind of dive into the sports performance, the exercise physiology side, the better a coach he or she will be, because you have a deeper understanding of the demands and what the body's capable of.
And my obviously I agree, and Jack, thanks obviously for having us on, having me on as well. And obviously we're in a weird time in the world for all sorts of reasons and circumstances, but the virtual world we're in right now with Zoom and the webinars and the workshops and everything that's going on in the world right now, because we can't have the human contact, I just encourage, I know I'm going to be doing my best too, and I encourage others, don't, just because things might improve in 6 months doesn't mean you stop having the conversations and the ability to virtually connect and continue to educate yourselves. Because I think a lot of people have used this time where we're not recruiting every weekend, right, guys, to continue to improve each other and improve ourselves. And hopefully, hopefully everybody continues to do it, because I do think it's great. So.
Awesome. Guys, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I think, speaking to Kyle's statements, I feel like, yes, it's great when the sport coach comes to me, but I think I've also learned, over the last little bit here, Fergus Connolly has a great book called Game Changer, and he talks about working your way from the sport on back to the physical demands of the game while being cognizant of the other factors like Kyle was referencing from tactical periodization. So for me, it's kind of changed how I've thought about things. Now I try to, have if I need to know the sport, I need to have conversations with you guys, then work my way back and be aware of all the other components that you guys have to worry about, so that I can somehow incorporate maybe certain things into what I'm doing. So I appreciate this. This is something I want to do a lot more on the podcast, is bring on coaches like you, so I have a better understanding of how to operate as well. We just can't operate in silos. And like you said, Max, this is the time to get out of the silo. So, but yeah, no, thank you very much, guys. Appreciate your time. And let's stay in touch. Keep chopping it up.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Jack.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Awesome.